for me as the chair of Compass, because what you were talking about was, in a sense, what we're trying to do with politics. How can you move away from, how can you kind of know the things that you believe in, the values that you have, but do them in a way that you were suggesting, that has real dialogue, that has real listening, that has real pluralism, that has real respect, that honours other people, and from all of that begins to grow a different kind of politics against the politics of the machine, that you're trying to have a conversation and respect people and talk and listen while they're trying to cut your legs off. That's the struggle that I think that we face, and that's why we have to learn how to do this stuff better and be better at it. Now, to get some responses from our panel. First, we're going to hear from Ed Mayo, who is someone who's been practicing the art of cooperation a long time before he became the Secretary General of Cooperatives UK, which is the trade body for the cooperative movement in Britain. Before he did that, he was the Chief Executive of the British National Consumer Council and its predecessor organisation, Consumer Focus. Before that, he ran the New Economics Foundation and he ran the World Development Movement, and he's published tons of books, not least one called Consumer Kids, which I have particular empathy for. It's only 21, he's done all of that, and it's an amazing achievement. They say that there's only two problems with the cooperative movement. Obviously, it doesn't cooperate and it doesn't move. Under Ed Mayo's leadership, it's doing both very well. Ed, would you like to respond? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil. And just sort of taking your last cue there about this is stuff that we need to learn. I think there's also stuff that we have to unlearn. And we have, I mean, here we are in a, kind of a university of learning. I kind of, in my mind's eye, I imagine universities of unlearning. And maybe that's what the Occupy movement was, because there's so much of culture which actually is corrosive of everyday cooperation. Sheer inequalities are corrosive of education. Stressing that kids need to get ahead of others, essentially bringing competition into schooling, I think is corrosive of respect and cooperation as well. So I think there's learning and there's unlearning in a sense. The cooperative movement, yes, dates back to the 19th century. It's got proud history. 1844, there were 24 Rochdale pioneers. And nowadays, you wouldn't be able to get away with that. There'd have to be one social entrepreneur and 23 others. But it was 24 pioneers that started the first cooperative business. And the language, you're right, was beautiful. Settlements, yes, friendly societies, cooperatives, mutuals, reflecting the kind of economy that we wanted to create. And it's interesting time now because, and this book is so welcome, because actually what we're seeing is a renewal of confidence in those models. And confidence has been one of the things that in some ways we have lacked, whether it's because the focus is on politics, as you've said, whether it's because we've been countercultural or not, I don't know. But confidence makes a huge difference. Coming out of the Occupy movements, we've had a campaign launched just in the last few months here in the UK, following one in the States, called Move Your Money.
Yes, wonderful.
And Move Your Money is a very simple proposition that you may all, perhaps, consider moving your bank accounts from one of the shareholder banks, beautiful, one of the shareholder banks that got us into the mess in the first place, into one of the cooperative or mutual banks that are there, Cooperative Bank, Nationwide, building societies, credit unions and others, and a sign that there is a mobilisation and there is a sense of confidence and an action that is emerging. I wanted just to tell a very brief story, if I may, triggered by listening to you, kind of Richard, which is my visit about 3 weeks ago to the kind of town in the middle of England called Tamworth, where I visited the Tamworth Cooperative Society, which does date back quite some time. They only work in Tamworth. They don't step out of Tamworth at all. And I visited some of their operations, co-op stores, as it were, and passed and met the chair, the elected chair of the Tamworth Cooperative Society, whose name is Audrey. And I saw her at work. She's a lollipop lady, and she was helping kids across the street. And then later that afternoon, I saw her at work in the boardroom, again, just gently massaging these different egos around the table. And she is somebody, Audrey is somebody that would not be in that position in a British business in the normal course of things. It's not just the gender ceiling, it's a class ceiling as well. And not incredibly vocal, but she had the skills and craft of cooperation, in a sense. And linking a bit to that, I wanted to suggest whether there might be two other ingredients to the craft of cooperation, and they may fit into your three headings, but I'd suggest these humbly. The first is humour, and the second is punishment. The first, humour, again, another cooperative I went to visit, Suma Whole Foods, is the most democratic enterprise, perhaps in Europe. It's a worker cooperative. We talk about democracy in a political context, and they talk about democracy in an economic context. Deep equality embedded into the whole business. But the cafe that they run there has got the loudest laughs and humour of anywhere. And it's quite, raucous, it's quite ribald, it's not polite. It probably does get on people's kind of nerves at times. But it made me think, listening to you, about the role of humour, and I wanted to ask about the role of humour in the craft of cooperation in terms of maybe as a route into empathy. The second was punishment, because I find that when I say I'm from the cooperative movement, and yes, we do both, people expect you to be a hippie, and yes, I am a hippie, no question about it. But they kind of expect it to be unconditional love. And unconditional love is something that I kind of tend to keep for my kids, for Neal, for my sister. Whereas I think a lot of cooperation is also being willing to cry foul when people step out of line. You talked about children playing together and creating the rules of the game, creating fairness. And I think part of cooperation is being able to withdraw your cooperation from those that are simply not interested in being fair or equitable or playing the game. And that in itself can be cooperative, because sometimes in the games theory, that people that model this stuff, it may cost you to punish others. But I have this theory, and I'll close on this, that it is a theory that perhaps explains the British love affair, subjunctive love affair perhaps, with the murder mystery that is on our screens. Because I have a sense that we have this inner eye that is always tuned into looking for people that are cheats and free riders, and those that will break the rules of the game, those that will not cooperate, even when you try and you offer and you try again. So the murder stories, the kind of all of those are all about an innate sense of cooperation, of working out where you can cooperate, and for those that don't, spotting them as early as you can. So thank you so much for your book. It's one thing that I think is helping give us confidence in those that are about this kind of community organising in the economy and in society. And to ask you a question about two other elements, about humour and about punishment.
Okay, thank you very much, Ed. Now, Hannah Worth, who's the director of the Chamberlain Forum in Birmingham, an organisation that helps build communities and neighbourhoods in that great city. It's an organisation that thinks and does, and I noticed today had a picture of Gandhi on its website, so it feels quite like Compass, to be honest. So Hannah, what does this kind of mean to you as someone who's doing some of this stuff on the ground in Birmingham? Thank you.
Thank you. As Neal just said, we do present ourselves as both thinking and doing, and Chamberlain Forum was set up by a group of community organisations in Birmingham who decided that policy making isn't something that should just happen in Whitehall or in London, but actually something that belongs to everybody. And I think kind of the reaction that maybe people instinctively have to Richard's comments about kind of the think tank response, what policies do we need then, is because maybe too many people feel removed from policy making. It is an us and them situation. I believe that there needs to be a kind of a democratisation of that policy-making experience. And so I suppose I was interested to hear you say, well, actually it's about what happens at the grassroots from the bottom up, because I very much believe that. I also used to work for an organisation called Birmingham Community Empowerment Network, which happened to be a government-funded programme, but was actually turned in many areas into a very grassroots bottom-up process. But I very much believe that power does need to be taken and not given, and that people do need to organise for themselves. However, I do think that there is a role for policy and for policy making in enabling and nurturing the ability in shaping the context that makes cooperation easier and more meaningful, and also policies that don't necessarily get in the way. So one of the examples I was thinking of today before I came down here was a funding programme that I was involved in. And it was called Real-Time Community Change. Now, often in the community and voluntary sector, funding can be used as an instrument, sometimes intentionally, often just as a byproduct of the way that it works, to kind of divide and rule. And it very much acts against the ability of people and resident community groups to cooperate as they might naturally. And so a number of years ago, I was involved in this programme called Real-Time Community Change that sought to put decisions and power about funding and resources directly into the hands of community groups. So it wasn't large amounts of money, for example, about £10,000 given to a group of community organisations together who were given the opportunity to determine their own priorities for action, what was important to them, and therefore what they might be able to do to respond to them, and how they might collaborate in doing so. So each group that was involved in that process came up with their own ideas of something they wanted to do, but they had to convince other people around the table that that was the right thing. So there was an emphasis upon both kind of persuasion and developing a kind of a win-win situation. But also, as people kind of warmed to the situation whereby they were on the other side of the table. It wasn't an us and them, a funder and a fundee, but they were all actually developing this together. You found that people were actually prepared to give things up as well. So it actually became a process whereby people could become more generous through cooperation and collaboration. So I think that policies and funding policies are really important to determine centrally that can have a really big difference locally. And actually something that's happening at the moment, I don't know if anyone here is involved in Community First anywhere in London. It's something in Birmingham that's because Birmingham has the unlucky distinction of having many deprived wards within its boundaries. Community First as a programme is kind of pushing some funding down to ward-based level, and again setting up community panels to make decisions. And I think this is actually a positive policy that, when it's done well, can enable people to actually cooperate and work together. The other thing I just wanted to comment on really was, and you mentioned it, Ed, as well, in terms of learning and different approaches to learning. I think that we need to develop some new tools and approaches for how we learn together with politicians, with public civil servants, with resident community groups, that learning is something, again, that people collaborate together with. And something that Chamberlain Forum has also developed is a method. I think we probably stole it at some point from someone in America and kind of rejigged and renamed it at some point. And it's called structured dialogue. And the idea is to listen to stories of experience and to be able to turn them into theories of practice, which could also become policy. And the idea is that because you have a diversity of people around the table, you create a story circle whereby you listen to someone's story of experience and you generate collective insight on that experience. So you pose questions, but the answer isn't necessarily definite. And through that process of listening, questioning, and understanding, that collective insight is used to form a theory. So I think, rather than kind of continuing our dialogue and our public dialogue with politicians and community groups and residents in a kind of backwards and forwards kind of way, or a tick box way, we need to find ways of truly learning from experience.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you very much, Hannah. That was very interesting. Next, we've got Deborah Orr. If you ever pick up The Guardian on a Saturday, you'll read Deborah's column. I think she's a rare breed of columnists in the sense, for me, she's a rare breed because I enjoy reading her. Because I never quite know what she's going to write about, and I never quite know what she's going to say, but I always come away thinking more deeply about whatever the issue was than when I started. She's been a journalist on City Limits, The New Statesman and The Independent. And given I never know what she's going to say, I certainly don't know what she's going to say now. So Deborah, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear on this?
Yeah.
That's very cooperative of you. Thank you. Yes, it's all quite complicated, isn't it? Here we all are talking about how change has got to come from the bottom. And I don't feel we really are from the bottom. It's hard to work out how we can really go out and tell everybody at the bottom how they've got to come around to our way of thinking and, you know, behave in that way, and then everything will be better. It's always quite curious and difficult. And that, of course, is the trouble with policy. You know, policy is top-down. Non-policy, you know, the policy of not having policy is top-down as well. So it's just another way of saying we're not getting through, we're not communicating. Let's try another way of communicating with these lower-down people. It's all very difficult. City Limits, which Neal mentioned, was a workers' co-op, actually. As I was coming in here this evening, I ran into B. Campbell, who's in the audience and was also in the co-op too. I think we've all got quite odd memories of what it was like to work in a workers' co-op, because it was a hotbed of intrigue. It was full of factions. The typesetters hated everybody because they had the hardest, most manual work. The advertising department hated editorial because we were all hoity-toity and sort of said, yeah, well, they may want to do a double-page spread, but it's shit and we're not going to say it's any good. So there was all of this conflict all the time. And you had some people working hard, some people not working very hard, some people who were very good at their jobs, some people who were very bad at their jobs. But everybody had to be treated equally and everybody had an equal say. I think the most... I mean, it was great, I loved it, but, you know, it was full of problems and fraught with difficulty. The point at which I thought, this is actually just a crazy, crazy thing, was where we were in another of our great financial crises. We'd got a full co-op meeting, which meant that everybody had to be there before there was a vote. This is something that everybody had to be voted on. And somebody was, in order to save the co-op and make the magazine better and make everything better, someone had put forward the proposition that we should have better writing. There was an editorial team of 3. I was the deputy editor, there was the editor, and there was the assistant editor. So we were the people who were the gatekeepers of the writing, and because we didn't have much money, we were also the people that were doing a lot of the writing as well. So, you know, it felt, you know, a little bit critical, and it also felt really, really impossible. But anyway, somebody proposed this, somebody seconded it, there was a vote from the co-op. Everybody voted for better writing except the editorial team, who did most of the writing and commissioned all of the writing and edited all of the pieces, and the publisher, who was the boyfriend of the editor. So just, you know, being equal isn't enough. Although we were all equal, some of us were more equal than others. We were seen as being in charge, the bosses having the most glamorous jobs. You know, so others on the co-op resented us, and all of these things sort of happened all the time. So certainly cooperation isn't structural. But there is actually there are actually organisations that do work in a cooperative way, and in a way that's cooperative in the sense that Richard discusses. There are quite a lot, and one that I think is sort of worth talking about, partly because of the way we live now. Richard's book is very good about talking about the psychological toll that takes on us. So you have people becoming redundant, and then within a few months, you know, their marriage is breaking down, or you know, they get into alcohol problems and so on. This is sort of a, you know, phenomenon that happens within 3 to 9 months of redundancy quite often. You have other things like, I like if I can just read a little quote, the titanic struggle against oneself, the metaphysical anxiety of fitting in the modern world and being getting a job and conforming. I think that's a lot of the reason why things like binge drinking and alcohol dependency and drug use and, you know, going wild at the weekend and losing yourself has become such a big feature in our society. It's part of trying to escape from conformity and trying to be very narrow in that way. So I think that a lot of people do get to a stage where they are a substance abuse problem or a psychological problem. And a lot of the time, I don't want this to sound like cheerleading for a particular organisation, but if you're not supposed to talk about the Alcoholics Anonymous group and promote the Alcoholics Anonymous group, but it is worth looking at the way it's structured, because even though it's gaudy and that puts a lot of people off, you can, you don't have to think about God, you can think about whatever you see is more important than individual human beings. So you can replace God with society. So, society, the interconnectedness of human beings is your higher power within this. And how that thing is structured is that, everybody who comes has a similar sort of problem, although people are different. You're always told when you come along, because people come along and they're often very resentful. They don't want to be like the other people. They want to see their problem as different. Oh, I'm not like. You're always told when you're listening to other people's stories, always to listen out for the things that chime with you, the things that you can agree with, the things that make you the same as everybody else and not the things that make you different. And I think that that's just a very, very basic thing that human beings quite often kick against. They're often, although we're quite tribal, we are at the same time, if there's a lot of people with a problem around, you do find yourself thinking, oh yeah, but their problem's not like my problem because they've got such and such or they've got so and so. So you have this society where what's in our interests is to concentrate on the things that bind us and the things that are the same. If you look at multiculturalism, for example, it was actually wrong because it was all about focusing on what made everybody different, when what makes everybody the same is what makes us cooperative. So you have to respect difference, but at the same time seek unity. We all need to eat. We all need to live without fear. We all need to have shelter. We all need to be able to look after our families. We all need to be able to look after our health. These are things that bind absolutely everybody. And a lot of the time, we are busily looking at the things that make us different. Rich people, poor people, young people, old people. They can't understand, so we are not going to explain to them. And a lot of politics is like that as well. Barely anybody in this room can even conceive of why people vote Tory, but people do. But a lot of the time we're not even talking to people who vote Tory because they're so different to us. We think, but they are the same as us, and they've come to different conclusions out of the same desires as we have for security, for sympathy, for empathy. So a lot of the time we are seeking difference and we are seeking to align ourselves with people who are set against other people. And it's hard to see how, as long as we remain that individualistic, we can really, become more cooperative, especially from the bottom down. People need to, I think, just help each other and listen to each other. And a lot of the time, you're swimming against the tide if you try to do that. Things are very professionalised. You know, you go to the doctor, you seek help. Perhaps you might need to speak to a psychiatrist. Perhaps you might need to go on some drugs, rather than perhaps you might just have to sort of meet up with some other people who face the same difficulties as you, and have them listen to you and you listen to them. And a lot of the time, things can be more simple than they are. And that's all I've got to say about it, really.
Very good. Thank you, Deborah. I think that notion of that ambivalence is absolutely right. So if Deborah is a columnist worth reading, then I think Lisa Nandy is an MP who's worth supporting. She's been the Labour MP for Wigan for 2 years, and I know for her it feels like about 10. Before she was the MP for Wigan, she worked at Centrepoint and for the Children's Society, and she was a Labour councillor in Hammersmith, and there are very few members of Parliament who inspire me, and Lisa Nandy is one of them.
Thanks, Neil. I think last time you introduced me as the most annoying MP in Parliament, so that's definitely an improvement. I'm really interested in this distinction that Richard makes between the political and social left and the idea of solidarity and cooperation, because I represent a town, Wigan, which is part of Greater Manchester, but really spiritually part of Lancashire, that seems to me to embody both of those traditions, from, you know, to continue the Gandhi theme, going back to the cotton mill workers across Lancashire who stood together in solidarity with their co-workers over in India, all the way through to the community organisations, the trade unions, the credit unions that still flourish in Wigan today. And it seems to me that those two concepts are not in tension. Like Hannah, I tend to think that we have a job to do to shape our institutions so that they create the right conditions for the sort of cooperation that Richard describes, both as an end in itself and as a means to an end. And it seems to me that over the course of my lifetime, I was born in 1979, that those structures have weakened or disappeared altogether that enable us to do that. Competition has become a very dominant force. The market, it was assumed until very recently, could solve most of our really pressing problems. And one of the reasons that I find the big society very insulting as a concept is because I think, having done all of the things that Neal talked about before I came into Parliament, that what I've seen both in Hammersmith, where I was a councillor, in Wigan, where I'm the Member of Parliament, and across the country, I've seen people doing all of those things, naturally collaborating, working together for the benefit of themselves, of others, and of their communities. But what I've also seen is a complete failure in the political system to either create the right conditions by taking action, or, as Hannah alluded to create the right conditions for that to flourish by getting out of the way and letting it happen. I think that there are several ways in which we need fundamental change to get those conditions right. Firstly, because I think on the economy, we face the enormous challenge of multinational companies now that operate across borders, that some of whom go around the world putting profits before people, with appalling consequences both for people and the environment. And many of those companies actually outstrip the power of individual nation states, both in terms of their turnover and in terms of their influence. And it seems to me that we've got a collective failure of the international institutions that we've got to really take that on, that we've become locked into this model of competition rather than collaboration. And I am frequently told by some of those large organisations that when they do try and uphold the highest ethical and environmental standards across the world, they are undercut by companies who aren't prepared to do the same, often with the support of states, including our own. And it seems to me that we need fundamental reform to make that stop. And closer to home, in the UK workplace, we've got a growing army of agency workers in this country. Richard talks about it in his book, about the impact of temporary work and project-based work and what that means for relationships at work and people's opportunities to get to know each other and work together. And it seems to me that with unemployment going through the roof, that there is a real danger that this gets worse and not better, that we in an era of high unemployment, unless we strengthen our collective institutions, for example, our trade unions, which have falling membership, partly as a consequence of the weakening and diluting of labour laws over several years. If we don't take action on that, we're going to see that get worse. In the 25 years since 1984, collective bargaining coverage in the workplace has fallen from 70% to just 33% in 2009. Less than a third of people in the UK workforce are in a trade union, and this is a process that we're seeing dramatically escalated under this government. And I wanted to agree with something that I've heard Richard say before, which is about resources and the impact that inequality in resources has on the ability to cooperate, because I do think it takes resources, and no more so than the really precious resource of time. So often what I hear from the people that I represent and from other people when I come to events like this is that people just simply don't have the time to do some of this stuff. It's not just about working long hours, it's also about decent pay, because the reason that many of my constituents work long hours is because their first job doesn't pay enough, so they have to take a second or even a third, if they're lucky enough in this climate to get that, in order to survive. And that means that they have very little time left to actually engage in the sort of cooperation that they'd like to. And I think it means differences to policy as well, and that's where I would depart from some of the things that Richard said. For example, why is there no right in this country to request time off to care for elderly parents in the same way as there is for children? It seems to me that the state has a really strong role to play in helping us to tackle some of the pressures that are on families, stretching them to breaking point up and down this country. And in social policy, I think we're going in exactly the wrong direction. Ed referred to it in his contribution about schools being pitted into competition with one another and children being pitted into competition for places and for resources, that we're seeing the breakdown of local accountability in our school system. We're seeing academies and free schools drawing their own converting without any regard for the wishes and feelings of their staff or of their communities, of the children within those institutions. We're seeing free schools drawing their boundaries so as to exclude certain groups of children. And when you put that together with the breakdown in universal services, libraries, Sure Start, the huge income barriers that we're creating to college and university, when you put all of those things together, my question is, when are children from different backgrounds ever going to meet one another? And Richard makes the point really powerfully in his book that cooperation is about learning to coexist with people who aren't like us. If we don't meet people who aren't like us, who don't come from the same backgrounds, who don't have different beliefs, if we don't meet those people, how do we ever learn to cooperate? And finally, I just wanted to say this on the issue of politics, because I think this is really important. Really interested in Richard's point about language and the language that we use. It seems to me that in an era where politicians are perhaps, apart from the bankers, the most hated human beings on the planet, and the levels of public trust is so low in politicians, that the obvious response would be for greater clarity in terms of what we're actually saying, what we actually stand for. And I do think that's important. But listening to Richard, I was reflecting on the fact that you need to couple clarity about what it is that you stand for and what you're saying with the right language that allows for that openness of debate and concedes that perhaps, just perhaps, I or my colleagues may not have got it right first time and there is something to learn. And I think that it's very difficult in the adversarial political system that we have and in the era of sound bites that we live in, which really mitigates against that kind of collaborative approach. But I believe really firmly after just 2 years in the British Parliament that we have to rediscover political parties as the broad churches that they once were, where it's perfectly possible to have an openness of debate and discussion within political parties as well as between them. It seems to me perfectly possible that a sense of shared destination can coexist with open and genuine disagreement about how you get there. And it seems to me that when we take on some of the big questions of the day, like higher education funding or care for the elderly or the purpose and nature and distribution of pay in this country, when we're talking about things that quite simply are shades of grey and not black and white, it insults the public's intelligence when we pretend that those debates are simple and that they are black and white, because they're not.
Right, fantastic stuff. We have 20 minutes left. And at this point, we're going to listen to you, not your words, but the meaning behind your words. So if Gavin and Joe could find, you can ask questions or you can make brief points, but let's respect other people and make them as short as possible so we get as many people in as possible. Why don't we just start up this side, Gavin, and just get the people with their hands up. Yeah, so Dan there, we good?
Yeah, Dan Taubman from UCU, but speaking in a personal capacity. I just want to bring a glimmer of hope to this and just say a few words about a campaign that we were involved in last year around provision of English for speakers of other languages. So I think it goes to the heart of what Richard was saying. Very briefly, what the government was proposing was that many of these students who, by and large, are on the most marginalised in UK society, women, often from black and ethnic minority communities, were going to have to pay, those that were on benefit would have to pay for their courses, anything from £1,000 to £3,000. A campaign was started, and it was a bottom-up campaign, and in the 40 years that I've been working on campaigns, it was the most imaginative campaign that I've ever been involved with. And I think it partly was because of actually what ESOL is about. It is about teaching people to speak, and to do that, you have to listen. And it was marvellous because we were partially successful. We got the policy blocked, at least for a couple of years. But the group that was behind it have not stopped. They're now questioning their own pedagogy and their own practice, those that were tutors. We were able to make a space where students, the ESOL students themselves, were able to speak for themselves.
Thank you very much, Dan. Partial success, that feels like a triumph to me on the left. The guy with the blue jumper, we'll get this side and then we'll do you over there, so don't worry. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I've really enjoyed the discussion, but I'm impressed by your youthful enthusiasm. Deborah Orr used the word, the things that bind us together. It seems, as an old chap now, that the things that tear us apart are the governments that completely ignore us. I marched against the Iraq war. We went. I marched against the NHS reforms. They're through. We now, in our local constituency, which is Putney, very posh, is that the local MP stood up against the third runway. Now I read today that already a lobby is in place to try and get a third runway. So what does it matter? I mean, what does it matter if I fulminate to my children, my grandchildren, and all the other people that I try and talk to and look at me boring old fart? But it needs to be said. What is going to make us make the breakthrough against governments that we endure now?
Is there anyone else?
Thanks very much for your talk. I just wanted to pick up on something that Hannah and Lisa were talking about, which are these underlying structures that do impact upon how easy it is for us to cooperate, both at a local, national and even global level. All around us, we're surrounded by global free markets, we're surrounded by advertising that tells us to be better and get more money and get more stuff and have a better job than the people next to us. How can we cooperate to change those structures which force us to do the opposite?
Okay. Thank you. Brendan?
Brendan Martin, organisation called Public World. You talked very interestingly, Richard, about the divergence in the left from the political and social left, as you put it, which was very interesting. But I think, possibly as a consequence of that, or at least related to that, I think the left has also tended to lose interest in how the market works and how it should work. And it seems to me that we're now at a point in history where we have a really great opportunity to develop a new ethical framework for market relationships. And thinking about what you were saying about early development in children, you were talking about the way in which children learn about the rules and cooperation. So my question to you is, what is the relationship between cooperation and competition as you see it? And do we need to learn to cooperate in competing?
Brendan? John? And then if there's any over there, yeah.
Thank you. John, we've already touched upon the education reforms, so-called. My question, or my point quite simply, is how do we promote our values of cooperation in the health service after the passage of the legislation? Thank you.
Okay, the woman at the back, yeah, thank you. No, yeah, Deborah, that's it, yeah, thank you.
Caridwen Roberts, thank you very much, Richard, for your very interesting presentation.
Gavin.
I think it's one of the first things I've heard in the last few months which has made me feel a bit more cheerful. Why I felt a bit more cheerful was because I could relate it very much to the circumstances we're facing in the London Borough of Haringey, where I live, where one of the things we're looking at is what do you do when services are being disbanded and where we're trying to respond to the Localism Act and thinking about the implications of that. Now, one of the issues that I picked up from the gentleman who talked about cooperative academies, which I thought was a very interesting approach, was that actually sometimes there are unanticipated consequences in pieces of legislation, and the interplay between politics and social is quite important here. What we're finding we're doing in the bit of London I live in is we're thinking about how we can actually cooperatively work to deliver and think about issues for our local community in a different way. And so that is, to us, an anticipated consequence of the Localism Act, much though we dislike it, and much though we dislike selling off public resources. So I just put that to you.
Thank you. And then this is going to be the final one, I'm afraid, this gentleman here. We haven't got any more time, I'm afraid.
Just very quickly, an observation, which is that a source of hope since the election, I think, has been in terms of, and also instances of cooperation on a national level, has been 38 Degrees and UK Uncut in this country, and they are places where resources where people have seen some real change and some real impact on the politics of the society, and they are hugely important and will continue to grow, I hope.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm sorry that there wasn't more time for more points and more questions. I'm just going to ask the panel running in this order. Funnily enough, we'll finish with Richard. I think that's fun. Somehow it seems appropriate. For the rest of the panel, just to pick up one or two of those points each before we ask Richard to respond to the debate and the questions. So, Lisa, if you could go first, please. Thank you very much.
Another example of cooperation on the panel. Thanks very much. On this question about school and education reforms, I completely take the point that the gentleman made at the back about, if you're faced with a choice about converting to an academy or potentially missing the boat, what do you do? And I think that going down the co-op route strikes me as a way to try and mitigate some of the worst effects of something that may end up being inevitable. And I certainly don't underestimate the challenges. I think it links in with this question about the NHS, because certainly on a local level, what I and my neighbouring MPs, Andy Burnham and Yvonne Favag, have been trying to do is work with GPs to make sure that once this stuff comes in, that we're actually all in it together. So we're preserving the structures that existed before, but we're doing it on a voluntary basis rather than a statutory basis. And I think that's got to be the right approach. This question about culture within the Labour Party, it was interesting when Deborah was talking about the handwriting discussion. I thought it sounds a little bit like CLP meetings within the Labour Party. I think there is a really big question about culture within all of the political parties, how open we all are to people coming in and how much the leaderships feel that they can let go. My own feeling is that with the rise of some of the new technologies that Richard talked about, Twitter and Facebook and the kind of instant messaging, that actually we're going to have to learn to let go and have a much more open, frank discussion and allow people with very different views. And I think this is partly a response as well, I'll finally say this, to the gentleman who talked about this thing about political parties just not listening and being done to. I was on the Stop the War March as well. I was really struck by something that Caroline Lucas said in a Compass lecture, I think it was last year, when she said when the three major political parties are wedded to the increasing privatisation of services, millions are denied a voice. I'm paraphrasing, so I may have slightly got that wrong, but millions of people are denied a voice. And what I would say to that is I know that we frustrate the hell out of you as politicians. I know that I frustrate some of my constituents when I do and stand up for things that they don't believe in and that they fundamentally disagree with. But what I would say is that there are some of us who are trying to change the nature of the debate within and between political parties. And one of the things about 38 Degrees and some of the other campaigns, that it often feels like, as a politician, I'm not trying to play the sympathy card here, but it feels like we're excluded from that process because we're branded as the same. The last MP that I got was, dear MP, you know, you haven't done this, why haven't you done that, you've failed, and it's the sort of language point that Richard talks about. It becomes very hard then for me to find a way in, to have that dialogue and be part of the constructive solution. And I like to think on things like the NHS and the education reforms that I am part of that fight, that I'm just trying to fight it from within rather than from outside. And what I would say is just maybe a plea that for those of you who do see some of us speaking up for things that you also believe in, like, give us a bit of support because we could use it. Thanks.
I just quite like to respond very quickly in some ways to what you said, the lady near the front here, about kind of community or communities is often kind of used by people who don't live in one or not part of one. And I think sometimes it is an abused term, but maybe because people have forgotten in some way that everybody is part of a community of some kind in some way. I see myself as part of many different communities. I'm part of several neighbourhood communities in places that I live. I'm part of various different women's communities, political communities, all sorts of communities of interest as well. And I think one of the issues that Richard talks about in his book in kind of a variety of different ways is how we manage complexity and how we actually use difference as a strength rather than as a weakness. And I think my experience at working quite a lot at neighbourhood level is actually neighbourhoods can be places in which you can manage complexity effectively and actually where you can really change things. I live in a neighbourhood in Birmingham, Balsall Heath, that was radically changed over the course of 20 years. And it's done so by a variety of different means. It's not perfect. People did organise. They tackled something they really didn't like. They tackled prostitution together, and they changed it for the better in the way that they wanted to. But at the same time, that's one kind of narrative of a success story. Beneath that narrative, there are many other different narratives as well of people who didn't necessarily agree with what happened, of various different views and opinions. It's a kind of, it's still quite a fragmented, multicultural neighbourhood in many ways. But yet at the same time, on my street, there are probably about 7 different nationalities on my a very small little road there. But actually, and we disagree with each other about some very profound things, particularly probably to do with equalities and sexuality in particular. But we don't talk about those things. We don't walk out our front doors and kind of look at each other with suspicion, knowing that we kind of disagree about religion. But we actually do things like we bring food round to each other's houses, and actually we're very kind, and my neighbour feeds my cat. And actually because of that, we have a level of human understanding which is respectful and kind and generous, I think, and actually cooperative, because we've decided that actually we're not going to win the argument. You know, they're not going to kind of convert me to their faith. I'm not necessarily going to convince them that some of my beliefs are valid, but we live together, and so we cooperate, because that's, I think, all you can do.
Yeah, Britain, I think, is a very neighbourly country, actually. And if you look, I mean, yeah, if you read the Daily Mail, it might tell you something different. But if you look at the statistics around neighbour interactions and like, actually, we are still incredibly cooperative. And we do different kinds of things. And maybe we do look after the pets, or we take the keys in, or we accept the parcels. You know, we don't have all the time that we did, used to. But actually, I think Britain is still quite a very cooperative country in the sense that Richard, you described in a hopeful way. I don't see, I understand all the angst in terms of the political left, but I don't see the social left as distinct from the political left. These are often the same people operating in different ways. We all have defaults, we all have areas that we tend to focus on, being involved in, kind of switching your bank account, say, from, one of the big banks to the cooperative bank or the credit union, for example, doesn't stop you being involved in politics. And so I think the social left has always been at a spectrum also with the political left, but probably the sinews did get stretched to a degree. One of the cooperative values is responsibility. So it is about self-help and mutual aid, but it is also about taking responsibility. And I think one of the issues in terms of politics is that 38 degrees, some of the big issues that we face like climate change are kind of bigger than our traditional form of politics, and yet there is no way round. We cooperate or we die. So we're going to have to find some solutions quick.
So we do.
I just want to quickly say that listening to what everybody is saying, to quote Tony Blair, it is all education, education, education. And I just feel that we've really messed up education so much over the last 30 years to address the lady who spoke so eloquently about working class culture. I think one way of making people resilient and giving people, you know, good cooperative characters is to give them a strong sense of themselves. And it seems to me that the centralised tick box, do this, do that education is kind of wrong, because what you want is for people growing up in a place to have a sense of place, a sense of self, and from that sense of themselves, then to spark the curiosity about finding out about other people and different lives, and that we just sort of fill children with facts and information and mechanical skills, literacy, numeracy, without actually giving them the sort of character and the grounding that lets them see before anything else what it's all for. So that's the change I'd like to see.
Should we exchange?
Shall we cooperate?
Yeah.
I forgot about cooperating altogether.
Again. Well, thank you all for these are wonderful comments and reactions. And I'd like to address everything, and we'd be here about 10 o'clock and we need a drink. I just say there's a couple of points I'd like to make, or things to raise in the end. I mean, when I wrote this book, I guess the kinds of people I was most worried about were people who were not joiners. You know, the kinds of people who weren't likely to worry about whether I should join 38 Degrees or the Labour Party, or if they'd made the right choice, us Greens. But we won't get into that. But what really worried me was, in the book, and if you read it, you'll see it, is a kind of person who just feels disengaged, and that cooperation doesn't happen on a much more gut level. And when I think about practical solutions about that kind of engagement, they come to me much more in sort of informal ways, you know? How is it that the experience of just feeling connected to other people can be revived? I'm involved in a campaign which may seem to you really bizarre, but is addressed exactly to that. In New York City, you can no longer smoke inside bars. You can't here either. But in New York, you can't smoke inside bars. And you can't, if you're under 21, if you're underage, go inside a bar. And one of the things that's done, oddly, is that when grandparents go out with their children, they are no longer going to the places that, when I grew up, they would go, which is you take the kid to the bar, granny or grandpa, in my case, has a smoke. Kids in the bar or outside playing in the backyard and so on. It's part of a kind of isolation of elderly people that's occurred in New York. You know, they don't have much experience of just being associated with other people. It's also very expensive now to New York City bars. So this campaign is to allow elderly people, I mean, it sounds bizarre, I know, and trivial, but allow elderly people to, if you're over 65, you can smoke in a bar. I know, it sounds trivial, but it's not trivial. 65? Yeah, no way. There are lots of little points like that in society where what we're doing is repressing the kind of everyday experience of informal cooperation, you know? We put a lot of stress when we've talked tonight, and it's right to talk about organized forms of cooperation, whether they're political or not. But I think what's really the menace in modern society, and particularly in modern cities, is that the places for people to experience cooperation, as you were saying, in this very natural way, are being more and more cut off. It's the same sort of thing, I just say one word about this, in those open plan offices, you know, which are supposed to be the offices of the future. My students and I have been studying them, and they diminish. There are no walls. Everybody's out in the same space. And what we've found is that people are less and less, if they want to talk to somebody, they leave the office, because that kind of notion of having a special place where you talk to somebody, a water cooler, right? Where you can actually have a one-on-one without being seen or overheard. Maybe gossip a little terrible without being overheard. Those kinds of spaces get annulled. So what I'd say to you about this is, to me, the issue is how, as well as organizing cooperation, how we can free people to be more informally cooperative. Because the way in which our society is working, whether it's institutions like bars or offices, or even the way we police streets, is really repressing this basic instinct that you want to associate with other people. And that, to me, is the kind of social problem that is particularly worrying. So much more to be said. The role of humor and irony, it's one of the great liberators in life, you know? Anyhow, let's not get started on that, but that's what I'd like to leave you with on this. I think informal sociability is an issue for the left, because the right is, through gentrification, through surveillance in these kinds of offices, and through health and safety laws designed to protect you, is diminishing that everyday experience on the ground of interaction with other people. So that's why this is, I think, an issue for the left. Thank you very much for coming. If any of you happens to go outside where I will be smoking, I'd be glad to continue this discussion.